Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Orr, the Dean of the School of Public Policy, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you tonight. Thank you all for waiting. Our guest tonight has literally just arrived from Copenhagen, straight off the plane, so that's how much this topic matters tonight to him and to us. He flew all this way just to meet with us tonight, and you all waited for it. So I do not want to spend any time that we could be hearing from Dan tonight, Minister Jørgensen, but I would like to welcome you all for this Brody Forum. The Brody Forum is a treasured tradition in the university of bringing leaders on pressing issues of the day to campus to hear from. And our speaker tonight fits that description to a T. A leader working on the pressing issues of the day. I do want to introduce him. He's not just a minister of climate, energy, and utilities. He's been a minister of agriculture and food. He is also a professor, very important in this audience. He has policy bona fides, he has political bona fides. One last thing I want to say by way of introduction. I know many of you are here because of the topic, but I also know some of you are here because of where Minister Jørgensen comes from. We will be talking about climate tonight. We will also be talking about Denmark. And I have to say, as someone who works on the international stage on these issues, it is a huge pleasure to welcome a leader not just on climate change, but a leader from Denmark, because we are depending on you for a lot, and you are delivering a lot. So thank you, Minister Jørgensen, for coming. We will have a little presentation, and then we're going to get right into a discussion with everyone here in the room. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I understand that they locked the doors so that you couldn't leave. Thank you for that also. Yes, well, my name is Dan, and I'm from... We are a small country, 5.8 million people, living on 16,638 square miles. So that's similar to Maryland, I guess. A little more people, a little less people, a little more space, but quite similar. We border Germany, Sweden, and Norway. We are a kingdom, meaning that the Faroe Islands and Greenland are independent nations, but a part of our kingdom. If nations were on Facebook, it would state, it's complicated. But this means, of course, also that we are an Arctic nation, so we see the consequences of climate change firsthand. Now, if you look at how much we emit when you talk about greenhouse gases, it's only 0.1% of the global emissions. So, isolated to that, maybe we're not that important. But nonetheless, we have an ambition to be world leaders in the fight against climate change, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. But let's just start by talking a little bit about the issue of climate change. This is me, a little bit younger, with no beard, with my good friend Jose Maria Figueres Olsen. He is the former president of Costa Rica. We were in Greenland. This photo is taken at a glacier. This is the tip of a glacier, just north of the city Ilulissat. The glacier's name is Ikisermia. This glacier is quite fascinating. When you look at it for a longer period of time, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes. First of all, there's the sound. It's quite difficult to explain. It's like if you imagine a thunder, just longer and deeper. That's the sound of the glacier moving. And then every 5 or 10 minutes, a huge chunk of ice will fall off into the water. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. This has happened for hundreds of thousands of years, but the pace that is happening now is unfortunately extraordinary. Every 24 hours, this glacier releases as much melting water as the state of New York uses in a year. Every 24 hours. When I showed that to Mr. Olsen, he said, well, this is the canary in the mine for our planet. You remember in the old days, miners would take canaries, and then when they fell off the stick that they were sitting on, it's because there was gas in the mine. Get out! Basically, this is telling us there's something really, really wrong with our climate. Now, some of you might know this guy, Nicholas Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank. In 2006, he released the Stern Review. It's a very important report because it opened the eyes of many people that weren't really studying climate change, but that were in the field of maybe economics or other academia. Because what he did was he applied the calculating methods of an economist to these issues and concluded that if we didn't act, then in very, very few years, fundamentally we would have to change our way of living. He argued that we would need to spend between 20 and 40% of our economic growth and our disposable means every year on just battling the consequences of climate change. Now, this was in 2006, and it really changed a lot. Recently, he said, I got it wrong. It's far worse. It's far worse. Now, I've been working with these issues for more than 20 years now, and normally, when you're in politics, often you will be met with alarmist messages, and you will then seek advice from some of the people that really knows their stuff, and usually after a meeting like that, speaking to the experts, you'll know the problem, but you'll also know that probably it wasn't as bad as they told you it was. The experts set them straight, right? The alarmists. But on this issue, it's the opposite. Every time I speak to a scientist, I always leave the room more of a pessimist than before I entered it. It's probably even worse than we think. Thomas Friedman wrote a book a few years ago called Hot, Flat and Crowded. It's a great book because it combines many of the trends that we see in the world today and shows how the fact that we have a hot planet, meaning climate change is here, a flat planet, flat Earth, meaning globalization, creates an interdependency among countries and parts of the world, and also a crowded planet because we have an increase in population. That combination really makes the challenge so much bigger. Here is a depiction of something all of you probably already know. Temperature increase, concentration of CO2 in... Is the microphone working when I'm moving my head? Okay, good. I did go to a university recently where people weren't laughing at my jokes, so I thought, well, is the microphone working? And somebody at the back row said, no, we can't really hear you. But then somebody at the first row said, I'd like to change seats then. Anyway, this is no laughing matter. There's a clear correlation. Now, you're smart people, so you know that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causality, but that's why we asked the scientists to look at the ice. This is people from the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen on the inland ice of Greenland. They drill 1.8 miles into the ice, and they can then look into the temperature and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere 800,000 years back. 800,000 years back. So it's no coincidence. It's there, it's a scientific fact. What you also need to take into consideration is the albedo effect, meaning that when sunlight hits ice or snow, most of the energy is reflected back into space. If, on the other hand, sunlight hits soil or water, most of the energy is absorbed. So the hotter it gets, the less snow and ice, the hotter it gets. And there you go. It's called a positive feedback mechanism, ironically, even though it's very negative. Now, the IPCC, 1,000 scientists from all over the world, say that we are 95% sure that this is primarily due to the way that humans live on this planet. Now, there's a lot of scientists here. You know what it means when 1,000 scientists agree on something. That's almost, I mean, that doesn't happen. So for them to say 95% sure is quite extraordinary. I know that some people still argue also in this country, unfortunately, that we don't really know whether this is man-made or whether we can do anything about it. For me, that's a little bit like playing Russian roulette. Except Russian roulette is one bullet in a chamber with 6 holes. It's like playing Russian roulette with a gun that has 10 holes and bullets in 9 of them, basically. Or put it another way, if you visited your doctor and the doctor said, I have some very bad news. You are very ill and you will die a slow and painful death. The good news is I know what you can do about it. You have to change your lifestyle. It'll have a lot of other positive side effects for you. How many of you would say, nah, I'd like a second opinion? And then when you ask 99 doctors, does all said the same? Doctor number 100 says, well, I agree that you probably are very sick. I'm just not sure that you can do anything about it. Would you then choose not to do anything about it? Basically, it's absurd that we still have people arguing not to try to stop climate change. So we have a hot planet. We also have a flat planet. When people flee their countries for political reasons or maybe because of climate change, it affects us all. Don't take, that's a cute baby. Do you agree? This is global citizen number 3,958,441,978. Do you agree he's cute? Very? Well, thank you very much. To be honest, we don't know if it's 78 or 79 because I don't remember the exact time I was born, but there is a web page where you can check that out. So, when I was born in 1975, there was less than 4 billion people on the planet. Today, we're almost 8. 44 years later. And soon we'll be more than 10 billion. So it's a crowded planet. This is a photo from China. Every day, 60,142 new cars in average hits the streets in China. More than 60,000. That's 41 per minute. India, almost 90,000 new air conditioners are introduced in India every day. That's 61 per minute. So sometimes I have a little bit of a hard time back home when I tell my dad that when you turn off the television, it's not enough to just turn it off. You have to stand up from the couch and walk to the wall and take out the plug, because otherwise there's this small red dot that takes up electricity. And an hour before, I told him about India and China and how 41 new cars hits the street every minute. I'll get back to why it matters to even do the small things when you're from a small country like Denmark. In 2040, India will use as much electricity as they do today, plus what the EU uses today. you all know the consequences. Some places on this planet you have drought, lack of water, you're not able to grow crops. Other places it's the opposite. There's too much water, there's floodings, extreme weather phenomena, glaciers melting. Water scarcity is probably one of the worst problems. This is just to show you what the difference is between a 1.5 increase in temperature and a 2-degree increase in temperature. Almost 250 million more people will experience water scarcity. This is Washington, underwater. If the temperature rises 1.5 degrees, here's 2 degrees. I have a very good American friend, I showed this and he said, well, so are there no negative consequences? It's not really a laughing matter though. Don't ask me, ask these guys. This is the military advisory board from 2007 during the Bush administration. I'm sure they're all fine gentlemen, but they're definitely not tree-hugging hippies, any of them, I think. They concluded that global warming and climate change is a threat multiplier in the world's most volatile areas. I'm no security expert, and I don't know what kind of language you're allowed to use in this room, but I asked some of my staff what it means, and they said, basically, we're fucked. Because where it's already bad, it's going to be even worse. Most conflicts on this planet origins in differences in ethnicity and political persuasion and religion. But if you look at what it is that they then actually fight about, it's usually natural resources. Access to water, access to possibilities of growing crops, and so forth. So it goes without saying that when the scarcity becomes worse, you also have instability. So, that's the depressing part of are the doors still closed? Locked? That's the depressing part of my talk. Now I want to tell you a little bit about what my country has done and what we plan to do in order to change the situation. We simply just stopped driving cars. Does that sound like a good solution for you? No. This is a photo from 1973, and it is actually from a Danish highway. You remember what happened in 1973? Oil crisis. All of a sudden, a country like Denmark, we were 99% dependent on importing fossil fuels. So what to do? Well, the government said, you're not allowed to drive cars on Sundays. I don't think we would get away with that today, but they did. The good thing that came out of that was, I think most people all of a sudden understood that maybe it wasn't that good an idea to be dependent on fossil fuels that you import. So that sort of sparked our transformation, not only away from oil, but also, and especially away from coal. And since that, a lot has changed. This is from 1990 till 2030. See, in 1990, our electricity was almost 100% from coal. Today, we have biomass, wind, solar, and in 2030, we will be, actually in 2028, we will get 100% of our electricity from renewables. Today, we are at 40%. Just a few weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of inaugurating our latest and biggest wind turbine farm, Horns Rev 3. If you promise not to tell anybody, because it's not a very good thing to do when you're Minister of Climate. I did take a tour with the Crown Prince in a chopper around these, and it's simply amazing. 39 of them. They are huge. One turn of the blades in one of these, creates enough power to charge 1,366 iPhones. It shows you how much they can actually do. Last Sunday, we had for the first time ever, 24 hours where we produced 150% of wind energy of what we needed in electricity. So what happens to that? Well, it goes to other countries. You cannot do a transformation like this if you are an isolated small country like Denmark. You need to be a part of an integrated energy market. So when the wind is not there, we still have coal power. Soon we won't have any of that. So we need to be able to get power from Norway. We export to Sweden, we export to Germany, and so forth. Has this hurt our economy and economic growth? Quite the opposite. Since 1990, our GDP growth has been 55%. Our energy consumption has decreased by 6%, and our emissions has decreased by almost 40%. This is the example that Al Gore uses in his very famous PowerPoint show also, that we've decoupled economic growth from emissions. Okay, that's what we have done. Now I'd like to say a little bit about what we want to do. But before we get to that, maybe it's a good idea to take a step back and look at what kind of a challenge this is. And here I'm very inspired by your former president, Obama. Barack Obama said that we are the first generation to actually experience the consequences of climate change, and we will be the last generation that has a chance to prevent them from being even worse. He also compared what we need to do with Kennedy's course for the moon. Now, as you remember, Kennedy said we will put a man on the moon in a decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. What he meant by that, of course, was in the process of doing this, we will become a smarter, richer, more innovative nation. It'll cost a lot of money, but we will have so many positive side effects that for that alone we should do it, even if we don't succeed getting to the moon. Now, of course, this is a different challenge because we have to succeed. But it's similar in the sense that in the process of doing it, we will create better societies. To do that, we need power. What is power? Well, most of the story of humankind, power has had to do with strength, the ability to force others to do what you want them to. And 1,000 years ago, we were pretty good at that. These are some Danes on their way to rape and pillage somewhere on the planet, probably. For hundreds of years, thousands of years, military power has more or less defined, and to some degree, still defines the power of a nation. But I don't think the route that we should follow is to threaten other nations with war if they don't do anything about climate change and if they don't make a reform of the way that they produce and consume energy. Obviously not. Instead, we need to look at a different type of power. Some of you probably know this guy, Joseph Nye. I was fortunate enough to visit him at Harvard, Kennedy School of Government. Quite impressive to be in his office because he has a photo of him and Bill Clinton on his desk. I also have a photo of me and Bill Clinton. He was very happy to meet me. I'm very pleased to meet you, he said. I guess that's what it means. But his is a little bit cooler because his is taken in the White House, in the Oval Office. Joseph Nye talking, Bill Clinton taking notes. And what he was probably telling him was that we have a possibility of setting an example, and by setting the example, you'll make other people and other nations do what you want them to do. Not threatening them, but just by showing them what can be done. It's a little bit of a simplistic way of putting it, but that's the core of the argument. Meet Sven. This is my mentor, Sven Augen. He got me into politics, and this is when I was elected to the European Parliament, first time in 2004. do what Sven does, vote for Dan. He did a lot of other things than vote for me, I can tell you. And I use him as an example because Denmark has actually been front runner before and has changed some very important things on the international stage by showing leadership. When I was a young man, I used to run Sven's campaigns. Unfortunately, he's dead now, but when he was still alive. And I had one photo that I always insisted should be in his different material. Even though it's a bad photo, you can hardly tell what's on it. But this is it. This is the meeting in the EU just before the EU had to go to Kyoto to negotiate the Kyoto Agreement. And that's Sven in the middle. And these are all of the ministers of environment in Europe. This one, you might know, that's Angela Merkel, now Chancellor of Germany. This is Margot Wallström, Commissioner for Climate and Energy and Environment in the European Union. Why were they all listening to him? Because at that time, we were the only country that had actually taken the steps forward to show people that you could do it without losing your ability to compete, that you could change from coal-based, fossil fuel-based economy into a greener economy and still experience economic growth. So when they were negotiating what will be the European pledge, and the other countries said, well, we can only pledge X percent and Y percent, but we needed a higher number. Sven Auken said, okay, well, it's up to you to negotiate. In my point of view, you can't negotiate with nature. So do what you can, and we'll take the rest. We'll take the rest of the obligation. I would have liked to see the expression on our Minister of Finance's face when he came home from those negotiations. But nonetheless, that meant that we could have a very ambitious target for the EU that they brought to Kyoto. That was a very important part of getting the Kyoto Agreement. We want to regain that position as world leaders, and we want to do it in two ways. First of all, by showing leadership in the way that we act nationally, domestically. And second, by showing international leadership on the global stage. First and foremost, we have just set a goal of a 70% reduction target compared to 1990 in 2030. Now, 70 is just a number, but if any of you have followed this discussion, you'll know that that is, Bob, don't look at me like I'm crazy. It's a very, very big number. To give you an idea, all of the things that I described that we've done takes us about half the way that we need to go. From 1990 till today, we've reduced with as much as we need to reduce from now till 2030. So it's a huge, huge challenge. Here's what some of the Danish newspapers wrote. It's extremely ambitious, and to be quite honest, we can't even tell the public of our country how we will achieve it, because listening to the scientists, they say, well, we can give you a blueprint of how to get to 60 or maybe 65. But again, we cannot negotiate with nature. So when the scientists tell us 70 is what you need, we need to choose to go for 70. Now, where we're taking it even further than that is in starting negotiations last week with the parties of our parliament in order to make a climate act that legally binds us to reaching that target. So then it's no longer just something that we hope to achieve, it's something that we have to achieve. And who will they blame if we don't? Well, the way that we see it is that the question really isn't what is possible. The question needs to be what is necessary, and the task then to make the necessary possible. This is a caricature made in a Danish newspaper. I actually don't see it like that every morning when I go to work. I see myself riding a surfboard up here because I feel that we have a momentum and the Danish population is really supporting our efforts. Definitely the Danish government is. Since 1947, we've had a committee of economics. I think most governments on the planet has one of them. This is where all decisions that has any financial or economic consequences are sanctioned and coordinated. If you didn't have that, very, very quickly your government would run out of money because all the ministers have many ideas of how to spend money, not that many on how to get money. So the Minister of Finance heads that committee, obviously, and you know the Eskimos has 100 words for snow. He has 100 words for no. Now we've created a new committee, the Committee for Green Transformation, with me as the chair. Now, I'm not going to say no a lot. I'm going to say, can we not do even better a lot? And I have the ministers for taxation, Minister of Food, Industry, Business, Environment, Transport, Education and Science. And for foreign issues, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Development. So this is not a government with 1 or 2 or 3 green ministers. This is a green government. We need, of course, legislation. What this committee will do is we will screen all legislation also coming from other ministries. So if you have a new infrastructure agreement coming up from the Minister of Transport, it needs to go through this committee, and we need to look at also the effects on climate before we make the decision. It's mainstreaming and streamlining everything so that you take the green responsibilities serious in all decisions made. But if you look at what originates in my ministry and what I need to negotiate before next summer, first of all, a Climate Act. That's the act that legally binds us to reaching the 70%. But then the big thing will be a climate action plan where we develop our energy transition even more, where we look at the transport sector, the agricultural sector, and also look at how can we involve citizens even more in this transformation. So that's what we're doing domestically. If we look at what we're doing internationally, we have bilateral cooperation with 15 individual states, the US being one of them. Maryland was actually the first state in the US that we had a formal collaboration with on wind turbines. China, 4 or 5 of my guys from the energy agency in Denmark are in China right now working. I think the engineers, I'm looking up at back, engineers, yeah, very smart people. But they have a lot of very smart people in China too. So the reason that they are there advising them is because of the transformation that we've done in Denmark. They are experts in how to basically turn down the power plants when you get wind energy without wasting the energy. That's a technical, very difficult question. But because they've transferred that technology now from Denmark to China, the Chinese have saved so much energy that if you look at the emissions, that has decreased, then that equals 62% of Denmark's total emissions. That's just 4 guys in China. And it shows you that if you take leadership and if you set demands for yourself that are very, very difficult to achieve, then the technology that you develop will then be useful for the rest of the world. Now, this we do from an idealistic perspective, obviously, but we also do it for business. We have huge companies in Denmark now that sell wind turbines and other kinds of green technology all over the planet. Later this month, the Crown Prince will accompany, I was just going to say the Crown Prince will accompany me, but that's not the way it works. I will accompany the Crown Prince to Paris to meet with other ministers, to argue our case and to prepare us for the COP25 meeting in Santiago, Chile later this year. And tomorrow I will be heading to New York for the Climate Action Summit. We've brought in a guy to help us at the summit. Some of you might know him if you're fans of Game of Thrones, Nikolai Coster-Waldau. Now, that's a very short version of a longer movie that you can find on the internet. But basically, our point is that, okay, so today 80% of the emissions, fossil fuel related emissions, are from energy. And since, for instance, energy from wind is now not only able to compete with energy from coal, it's actually cheaper. It is bit of a no-brainer, I'm sorry to say, that you should stop subsidizing fossil fuels and start just buying the cheapest stuff out there. Now, this is a photo from Berlin, 1989, when people took to the streets and created a revolution, introduced democracy. Now, of course, it's a different situation now, but actually, these demonstrations were in Copenhagen this summer. They weren't violent, they were peaceful, but they showed us that people really care about this. They want us to take these steps. For the first time ever in my country, climate change was at the top of the agenda at the election. It was the topic that was discussed the most, and it also had a decisive matter in how many people in the end ended up voting. I know that this differs from country to country, but it's my impression that in most countries of the planet you see this. And if you don't, you will see this. It's a common responsibility. We also need to remember that it's a common but differentiated responsibility. Because we in the US and Denmark cannot really ask the Chinese to not have economic growth. You cannot tell the Chinese, don't buy a refrigerator. Don't get a car for the first time in your life. Don't start to eat meat once a week. I think most Danes eat meat more than once a day. More than once per meal. What we need to do is tell the positive story. I could have used another example. Martin Luther King, he did not create a civil rights revolution in this country by giving a speech called "I Have a Nightmare." Right? He told the positive story. When I give this speech normally, I have a phone in my pocket, but I don't now, so imagine I have an iPhone. I went to Kenya some years ago and I visited the Maasai tribes. They literally live in houses made out of what comes out of a cow, right? Literally. But they all have iPhones. It's a great example because it shows you that they skipped the transformation that we've all been through. The normal phone, you remember? The first transportable phones, they weren't really even handphones. So the first phone that they ever got was an iPhone. And that's the way we need to look at it. The 60,142 cars every day in China needs to be electric cars. The air conditioners in India, 90,000 every day. It's no problem if they run on the renewables. It's a problem if they run on coal. Anyway, when Kennedy gave his speech in 1961, most people thought it was impossible. In 1969, this is the control room in Houston, Texas. The average age of the people in that room were 28. This means that when he gave the speech, that guy was 20. That's why I put some students from your university up here in the corner. Because we need you guys to sit there in the climate control room in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. You just proved not only that you're a good politician, but a good professor. A lot of content in there, but I do have to say, on the politician side, you're the first person that I have heard quote those three presidents in the same remarks, Kennedy, Obama, and Trump. So you've achieved something already that is a first. I want to open the floor for questions, but I'd like to just kick it off with one question about Denmark. Sure. And one question about this global leadership role that you've talked about. I don't make a habit of studying other countries' political platforms, but I actually read through A Fair Direction for Denmark. And I have to say, it was inspiring reading. I don't usually think of political platforms as inspiring. The first, in the summary of A Fair Direction for Denmark, the first thing mentioned in the entire political program for the new government, we must lead the fight against the climate crisis. But the program goes on to talk about inequality, welfare, education, integration. You know, in this country, we have a discussion such as it is about a Green New Deal, trying to integrate other important social goals with our climate goals. What would you say in terms of the way you've approached this in Denmark? What advice could you give an American audience that passionately is seeking the same thing that you're seeking to do with this program? What kind of advice would you give us? And don't be afraid. We like Danish advice.
Thank you. Well, it's a great question, and I think that we might end up in a situation, at least that's something that I fear, where it's actually not the technological problems anymore that will prevent us from solving the crisis. It's because it's become a social question. We see this already in France. President Macron set out some very ambitious targets. I applaud that. But one of the ways that he sought to achieve those targets was raising the prices on gasoline for normal people. Now in Paris, you have working poor. You have people having 2 full-time jobs and still being poor. So for them, rising the price on gasoline was a social disaster. So it's extremely important that first of all, we don't make the poorest people pay for the transformation. That goes, of course, for our own countries in the West, but it's, I think, an even more important point in the developing economies and developing countries. Because as I implied earlier, really, it's a common but differentiated responsibility. It's our fault that we have the problem we have now. It's not that China has taken 500 million people out of poverty in 15 years. I applaud them for doing that. So that also leads me to a second point, because on one side you have the people that are afraid that it will hurt their standard of living and their ability to have better life quality, living standards. And on the other hand, you also have people in the streets of some countries, my own included, that are radicals, that are striking and they're standing in front of a McDonald's so the people won't get in, all of these things. It's probably just a matter of time before you see the first groups closing down airports of civilian, what's it called? Civil disobedience, yes.
She's involved in civil disobedience.
Great. No, but I think what we need to do is find the middle way, find the middle ground. And in all modesty, I think that we've shown in Denmark that you can do that by always introducing new policies that helps us in the green transformation, but that also raises the general living standards. This also means then, of course, in some green organizations, it's not a popular point, but it is my point, and it is my government's point, that we are not anti-growth. If this becomes a question about growth or saving the planet, the planet will lose. So we need to make the growth green. People will not stop flying airplanes. In 10 years, will be 1 billion more people in a middle income range on this planet. Do you think they won't travel? So what we need to do is make the fuel that flies the plane sustainable. And it's not impossible, we can do it.
So one quick question about the global role that you aspire to. I like the term green superpower. I like the fact that Denmark is reclaiming its global leadership role. The last point in the program here in the summary of A Fair Direction for Denmark is we must shoulder a responsibility for the world. As an American, I'd like to be able to make that same statement about my country, but for a minute I want to focus on your country.
Sure.
What can Denmark do, and how does Denmark see its role in helping make sure access to finance flows to all the places in the world that need the same transformation, but that don't have capital markets, that they can't go out and raise the money? Sure. This is one of the biggest conundrums currently, is that there's so much capital out there, but it is not getting to the developing countries where there are investable propositions. What are you thinking about in terms of your global leadership role, in addition to showing us the way of what you're doing at home? What do you hope to do internationally?
Well, several things. First of all, we try to put our money where our mouth is, I think is an American expression. So we give a lot in development aid, and we are trying to green that aid. So utilize it in a way that helps societies transform in a just way. So it's a just energy transition that gives people access to energy. But apart from that, we are also trying to maybe see whether or not some of the policy instruments and frameworks of the Danish market can be exported. So as you know, Bob, this weekend we'll be presenting in New York a toolbox that we've developed with other countries, with big economic institutions, that shows how big private investors, huge pension funds, others that really have the money and want to invest them in energy transition, how they can then do it in a country that maybe doesn't have the most stable political environment. How do we set up a political framework that carries some of the risk for investors, and thereby utilize all of the money that's out there just waiting to be used on these areas?
Okay, it's your turn, folks. We don't have the minister for too much longer, so I would like you to identify yourself. I'll call on you. Let's get as many questions out on the floor as possible. And I would like students to step forward. Youth leadership matters. Not that faculty and others can't raise questions, but I know there are a number of not so shy students in this room. So if you could please identify yourself and pose a question. Let's start in the back. There's a shy student who would... Do we have another microphone, or I can...
Yeah, let's
Minister, I wanted to thank you first for coming real quick to just give us this presentation where I feel like you talked about necessities and inclusiveness. One of the things I want to mention, by the way, my name is Ian Sloan. I had a quick question more so about when you talk about oppositions in terms of how you have, unfortunately this narrative, this long narrative about like, oh, it's too expensive to switch over to try to do more renewable energy resource in terms of machinery and going in that production of that matter. You also have the opposition on why does this matter to me about renewable energy source and switching over to that. When you deal with opposition like that, especially in our country, what would be the first thing you would say to someone that has those two different narratives? Or at least to start with the first one about, again, the economic aspect. What would you say in terms of like how this mattered to switch over to that transition?
Great question. I think, depending on the person, I might start with a very simple argument like the one I made with Russian, comparing it to Russian roulette, or going to the doctor and being told that you are ill but not doing anything about it because, well, there's only 99 doctors that says it's a problem, and the last one that says it's a problem doesn't exactly know whether or not the treatment will help, really. So that's a logic argument. Another one would be, okay, imagine if there was some meteor coming towards the planet and we knew that it would hit us in 50 years and fundamentally change the living conditions on this planet, make extinct every third species on the planet. I think we would spend a little bit more money researching how to stop it than we do now on climate change. So these are, I think, logical, realistic arguments that should probably persuade most people. If they don't, say, okay, well, then let's not talk about climate change. You're right. Maybe. It's not a problem. Let's talk about economics. Let's talk about a hot, flat, and crowded planet. We don't have the fossil fuels to continue the growth that's already going on. And even if we did, shouldn't we use what's cheapest? So now, when wind power is cheaper than coal, obviously we should use it. If you look at one of the worst pollution problems out there, it's particles from cars. So when we switch into electric cars, not only do we reduce emissions, we also reduce particle pollution that kills people. Or, here's a revolutionary idea. Take your bicycle. More than 60% of people in Copenhagen go to work on their bicycle. It saves them time. They don't sit in I just said it from the airport here, and it makes you healthier. Save energy in your home, you save money. I actually forgot to tell you what I tell my dad when he says, why do I have to pull out the plug? I tell him, well, because we are such a small country, it's only 0.1% of the global emissions, so we need to do something extraordinary to make a difference. So we need to do everything we can, even the small things. But when we all do them, we can send somebody like Svend Auken to the EU and say, okay, we'll do the rest. We'll show the way. And then the EU does it. And then sometimes we even persuade the US. And when the US is on board, China is on board. And when we have China on board, we can save the planet.
Well, lifestyle is important. You've talked about eating, you've talked about biking. I would just note for the audience that hasn't experienced those bikers in Copenhagen, there is one safety hazard. Foreigners that don't know how to cross when all the bikes are coming. You got to take this seriously. Okay, more questions. Since I called you out for being a good civil disobedience activist, you get a question, Amelia.
Hello. So thank you for coming today. Tomorrow, as you may have heard, the global climate strike is going on, and it hopefully will be the biggest collection of students and young people that are drawing from lessons from the labor movement, strikes, to push the government into climate action. So as a person in power in the government, how have young people influenced how the platform came to be, and have they inspired action? Essentially, does this work, or are we screwed?
Well, we're screwed if you don't do it. Definitely. I think it does work. Even in a country like Denmark, where we have done this for decades, even in our country, the reason that we are now taking a step up is because of the youth. I don't doubt it. I've been working with this for more than 20 years. And I remember when I just started digging into the literature, for me, it was just mind-boggling. And I thought, okay, well, it's just a question of time before others will do this as well. And in a few years, this will be the topic on the agenda. And I said that for 20 years, but it didn't happen. And last year, somebody asked me, so what do you think will happen at this election? Do you think climate change will be on top of the agenda? And I said, no, probably not, unfortunately. I had just given up. Because year after year after year after year, you get new scientific proof of how bad it is. And year after year after year, you see that you can actually do something about it. And you would even have a better competitiveness in your society. So why didn't it happen? And my explanation of why it did happen is primarily the youth. I have personal friends, also in politics. I'm not going to mention names because some of them are ministers today. But that used to tell me, it's bad, but can you talk about something else, please? But now they've changed. And why have they changed? Well, they tell me because it's their kids coming back from school saying, why do we eat so much red meat? Why don't we have an electric car? Who are you voting for, Dad? I hope it's one of the Green parties. It does matter. I think where the danger lies is if the protests becomes too radical, so that they end up dividing a country instead of collecting all the good forces in a country. I'm no expert in American politics, but I do know that you have some problems with division of the population. So but I'm obviously quite serious that if this becomes a power struggle between classes, or even just between political parties, we have a huge problem. The biggest challenge for me right now in Denmark is to get the right-wing parties that are normally not as ambitious as my party is, to get them aboard, to get them to be a part of the Climate Act. Because if I don't, then what happens in 4 years if we lose the election? And actually, to be fair, one of the reasons why we've been able to do the transformation that we have on wind energy and renewables is because we've managed to make broad political solutions supported by all of the major parties. So even the ones that maybe didn't worry that much about the climate change issue, they were still a part of the negotiations and a part of the compromises, maybe for other reasons, but they were there. And that's also a signal to the market. Regarding your question, Bob, how do we get the big investors? Because these are huge investments. Yeah. And you won't get the market players in if there's not a political stability. So that's the only danger that I see, that you risk dividing. But I think that basically that's not the responsibility of the youth in the street. It's the responsibility of the politicians and journalists and others that interpret the youth in the street.
So we've reached 7 o'clock, but with your indulgence, Mr. Minister, could I collect 2 or 3 quick questions, and then you can do a grand summary and answer whatever parts of those
for
questions?
me, it's 4 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
it's fine.
You're already on your second day and the first day. So I'd like to invite Nate Hultman, and then we'll ask 2 more. We'll take 3. We will go 2 and 3.
So thanks, Nate Holtman at the School of Public Policy and also Center for Global Sustainability. So I worked in the Obama White House on our national target. I also evaluated other countries' targets as part of my job there. My current work is on thinking about, with a large collection of actors in the United States, what we could potentially deliver for 2030 under potentially new election outcomes at that time. And I have to say, and I want to say this mostly for the room, that the 70% 2030 target is a beautiful and extraordinary target. So let me just be very clear how ambitious the Danes are being with this target. And I think that we all ought to be impressed and respect and be grateful to what they're doing. So thank you, Minister, for that and for the leadership on that. Now, my actual question, and I'm sorry to go on about it, but could you, when you do answer questions, can you speak a little bit to this question of how you get those more conservative parties on board with this extraordinarily ambitious target? Because that's, of course, all countries are going to be wrestling with this. There's going to be more and less ambitious pieces of their countries. You spoke a little bit about this, you know, kind of making sure the tide lifts all boats, but in your specific case, how are you doing it?
All right, let's get the mic up to, oh, thank you, just up there, gentlemen.
Thank you so much for coming. My question is about the workforce and how you are preparing the workforce for the new job skills that are needed in a green transformation.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to do 4, sorry. Gentleman right there and then over here.
Thank you. I think partly to the question of how you get right-wing parties on board, I think a lot of people can get behind like not funding fossil fuels anymore and doing research and development on green energy. That seems to be a more or less popular thing, if not in the US, all the time. How do you get groups on board with, I know you said not to focus on the negatives as much, but there has to be some sort of, in many schemes, putting a price on carbon or some element of making gas a little bit more expensive. How do you pitch that? And, or if you, what I think you may have been suggesting is how do you do it without some sort of pricing or making fossil fuel products more expensive?
I'll stand up too. My name is Grant Prilliman. Most of you probably know the song Country Roads, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River. That's where my colleague and I came from today. We live in Jefferson County, West Virginia, about an hour and a half west of here. So I wanted to give you a quick statement, and then my ask is actually fairly simple. In our county, a renowned Danish company has now well underway in construction a plant to make mineral wool insulation. And in West Virginia, sadly, they were somewhat recruited, and they are going to burn 90 tons of coal and 1.6 million cubic feet of gas every day. They are less than 1,000 meters from an elementary school, and 4 other schools are in the plume. So my ask, sir, Minister, and I do thank you for coming, and you're an amazing speaker, it was very good, is would you take a few minutes, maybe give some information to your staff, let them look at it, take a few minutes, and please help us understand how to inform the people of Denmark about a company that belies your values. Thank you.
Yes, great question. We will definitely talk to you afterwards. If it's the company that I think it probably is, it sounds a bit strange because they market themselves as being the opposite. It's good to isolate houses, also for the environment, but okay. So my staff is up in the back of the room, so if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes with them afterwards. So great, but also very big questions. First of all, thank you so much for your kind words. It means more than you think, because the whole reason why we do this is, as I said, not because of the 0.1%, it's because we want to show people that we can do it. So it's nice when people actually notice. So thank you. How do we get the right-wing parties on board? I think I probably have to be quite frank and honest with you before or in answering that question, because I think when I say right-wing parties, you think of something different than it actually is in Denmark, because our right-wing parties are far to the left of your most left-wing parties. So it's a little bit different. We are a social democratic universal welfare state, meaning that we redistribute wealth. This also gives us possibilities of applying policies that you probably wouldn't have. I was looking around for a blackboard, what they called that in the old days. I don't know what you use now, whiteboard or something, but yeah. I'll try and, I wanted to just, but I'm going to explain it. This, oh, is there one?
You can
if I
use
can.
that, or the wall over there is
over
writable.
Well, so okay, so when you look at environmental problems, there's basically 5 ways that you can seek to address them. One, okay.
Try this.
One is regulation. Command and control, right? So you ban stuff. For instance, we've said in 2030, it'll no longer be allowed to introduce new fossil-driven cars in Denmark. So you won't be able to buy a new petrol car in Denmark. That's a very hardline way of doing policies. It's also very efficient. You can also set standards, so you can say, okay, you're not allowed to build a house unless you insulate it. So that's regulation. Then you have market-based instruments. And this is where we have some possibilities that you don't. Taxation. So we have huge tax on cars, for instance. You pay more than 100% of the car's price in registration fee. And this creates a possibility for us because it means that we can then change the registration fee on different cars and give positive and negative incentives. On the other hand, it also creates a challenge because the revenue from that tax goes to our welfare state. But we also have the European legislation, which we are an integrated part of. And here we have the European trading system, the ETS, where we deal with quotas of CO2 emissions. Actually, from a market perspective, that's more efficient than just putting a tariff or tax on something. Because if you do a cap and trade system, you also incentivize companies to reduce their emissions faster than they have to, because they can then auction their quotas and get a revenue. Then we have public spending. You can subsidize. We've done that for 30 or 40 years on wind, on other renewables. We're still doing it, but to a far lesser extent. And in the future, we won't be subsidizing wind turbine farms, we'll be selling concessions. So people will have to pay for them to put up a new wind farm. 4, voluntary action. By educating people, you can show them how they can also make a difference, or you can make voluntary agreements with parts of the industry. 3 days ago, our Prime Minister said that she wants now to talk to the entire Danish industry in different branches. So the tourism industry will have a meeting with our Prime Minister, and we'll set in place a collaboration with them to set a goal and how to achieve that goal. The agriculture sector the same, and so forth. That will not be based on regulation, command and control, it'll be based on voluntary action. And by the way, our Confederation of Businesses in Denmark, that I think it's fair to say historically hasn't exactly supported this agenda. This Wednesday they said, we're on for the 70%. bring it on, give us regulation, basically. It's a huge, huge progress. And 5, I would say, these are the ones you'll find in textbooks. This is the Danish edition. Planning. Planning. We have district heating in most cities in Denmark. Right now, Facebook just opened a new data center in Denmark. Now, for most ministers of energy on the planet, I probably think, I can say, that would be a bit of a problem because they consume a lot of electricity. How do you make sure that you can supply that electricity? Because their business model really doesn't run that well on not being able to guarantee that there's always electricity there. And then imagine having an ambition that you want to reduce by 70% your emissions. You would think that it was a bad day for me when I gave a speech at the opening, but actually it was a good day. Why? Well, first of all, because they only use renewables. And second, the heating that the data center creates are put into our central heating system. So that will be used to warm up almost 7,000 houses. And they give it for free. Why? Because we planned it that way when we built the city. I think that's the most simple way of putting it.
Professor Jørgensen, thank you for giving us a master class. I, for one, am very grateful that global citizen 3,678,000,000
something like that
was born and found his way in the world. You just mentioned your prime minister, and I have to say, you called on everyone here to think of yourself as that 20-something in mission control for climate change. I'm just glad to know there are 30-somethings and 40-somethings in mission control in Copenhagen.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Bill Brody for this opportunity. I think his parents, Norman and Florence Brody, who envisioned the idea of the Brody Lectures, had exactly this kind of conversation in mind. Let's bring the real leaders, let's talk about the tough issues, and put tough questions and very good answers out there. But I just want to underscore the minister's point that really what we're talking about when we talk about this issue is not actually going to come from my mouth, his mouth, or the others. It is those of you in the room who are under 30, and no discrimination against people over 30. Some of my best friends are over 30, but you are in mission control, whether you know it or not. And I think the questions represented that very well. You know what you're talking about. Say it with conviction and hold us all accountable. I want to not only thank Bill for this great opportunity for the Brody Lecture, I want to invite everyone to a reception just across the way in H.J. Patterson Hall. We'll have a chance to talk with the minister, talk with each other about just how we're going to solve all the problems we identified in this hour and a half. But thank you, Bill, and thank you to Betty Duke, our Brody professor, for this incredible opportunity. And thank you, Mr. Minister.